I've been teaching for 9 years, and I've never seen children play a game that ends with someone crying in the bathroom. That's how I should have known something was wrong from the start. But I didn't. I was too busy grading papers, too distracted by the usual chaos of a classroom to notice that the children had invented something that wasn't quite a game at all. Something that wore the mask of a game, the way a predator wears the skin of its prey. Convincingly enough that you don't notice the wrongness until it's far too late. My name is David Chen. I teach 4th grade at Riverside Elementary, a school that sits on the edge of a town that has learned to keep its problems quiet. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, but pretends they don't. Where uncomfortable truths are filed away in the back of filing cabinets and forgotten. I'd been there for 3 years when the new students arrived in September, a transfer from the district up north, 12 children who moved together as though they'd been transplanted as a unit rather than arriving as individuals. They were polite enough, quiet. They did their work, raised their hands, followed the rules with a precision that was almost mechanical. But there was something coordinated about them, something that felt less like friendship and more like an agreement, an understanding. They sat together at lunch without speaking much, moved together between classes in a formation that was too organized to be accidental. And during recess, they disappeared into a corner of the yard where the old oak tree cast a shadow that seemed to swallow sound. I didn't think much of it at first. Children form groups. It's normal. It's healthy. Cliques are a natural part of childhood development. I'd read the studies. I knew the psychology. And yet, there was something about the way they moved together, the way their eyes tracked each other, that suggested something deeper than simple friendship. It suggested coordination, purpose. The first time I noticed something was genuinely off, it was small enough that I almost missed it entirely. A whisper. I was walking past the bathroom during a lesson change when I heard it, a child's voice, thin and strained, repeating a number over and over. 23, 23, 23. The voice had a quality of desperation to it, as though the child was trying to anchor themselves to something, to hold on to a single point of reference in a world that was slipping away. I pushed the door open. A girl was standing at the sink, hands gripping the porcelain so hard her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, but she wasn't looking at her reflection. She was looking through it, past it, into some space that existed only in her mind. Her lips continued to move, the number repeating like a prayer or a curse. "Are you all right?" I kept my voice gentle, but she flinched violently, as though I'd struck her. Her hands released the sink, and she turned to face me, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The smile was the worst part. It was too practiced, too perfect. The smile of someone who had learned exactly what expression would make an adult stop asking questions. "I'm fine, Mr. Chen. Just washing my hands." But her hands were already clean, and her voice had the quality of someone reciting lines they'd memorized long ago, lines they'd practiced until they could deliver them without any emotion whatsoever. I watched her for a moment longer, trying to read something in her face, but there was nothing there. Just the mask. I let her go, but the number stayed with me. 23. It meant nothing to me then. I didn't know that it was a countdown. I didn't know that it represented the number of days she had left before something would come for her. I didn't know any of that. If I had, I might have done things differently. I might have acted sooner. I might have saved her. But I didn't know. So I let her walk past me, and I went back to my classroom, and I tried to forget what I'd seen. The pattern started small, almost imperceptible. I'd catch fragments of it during lessons, a child whispering under their breath while pretending to work on a math problem, another one's lips moving silently as they stared out the window at the playground beyond. Numbers. Always numbers. 17, 31, 42. Never the same number twice, never spoken aloud unless they thought no one was listening. The numbers seemed random, without pattern or logic, but there was a ritualistic quality to them, as though each one held significance that I couldn't begin to understand. When I asked about it directly, the children went silent. Not the silence of defiance, but the silence of people who had been warned not to speak. The silence of people who understood that certain things, once spoken aloud, could never be unspoken. One of them, a girl named Emma, finally broke under the pressure of my questioning. "It's nothing, Mr. Chen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just something we do." "Something you do where?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. "At recess." That was all I could get out of them. No matter how I phrased the question, no matter how I tried to make it seem like a casual inquiry rather than an interrogation, they would say nothing more. It was as though there was a line they could not cross, a boundary they could not breach without consequences they were too afraid to contemplate. The second week of October, I decided to watch. I told myself it was out of concern for the children's well-being, that I was simply monitoring the playground to ensure nothing inappropriate was happening. But the truth was darker than that. The truth was that I was curious. I wanted to understand what they were doing, what game they were playing, what secret they were keeping from the adults who were supposed to be in charge. I stood by the fence during recess, pretending to monitor the playground while actually keeping my eyes on the corner beneath the oak tree. The 12 transfer students had formed a loose circle, and in the center stood a boy I recognized, Marcus, one of the quieter ones, a kid who usually kept to himself and rarely spoke unless directly addressed. He was standing perfectly still, his face blank, his hands hanging at his sides like the hands of a puppet, waiting for someone to pull the strings. The others began to count. Not out loud, not at first. Their lips moved in unison, eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was as though they were performing some kind of ritual, some ancient ceremony that had been passed down through generations, refined and perfected until it had become something far more sinister than any simple children's game. Marcus stood perfectly still, his face blank, his breathing shallow and controlled. The counting continued, silent, synchronized, like a prayer only they could hear, like a spell being cast in a language that existed only in the spaces between words. And then one of them broke the pattern. A girl, I think her name was Sarah, spoke a number aloud. 47. The circle tightened. The silent counting stopped. Marcus's shoulders sagged, and he stepped out of the circle. He walked past me without looking up, his face pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. The color seemed to have drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a photograph of himself rather than the actual boy. The other children dispersed, returning to normal play as though nothing had happened, as though they hadn't just participated in something that felt fundamentally wrong. But I'd seen something in Marcus's expression, not sadness, not anger, fear. Pure, undiluted fear, the kind that comes from understanding that something terrible has just been set in motion, something that cannot be stopped or reversed. That night I looked through the student files. The 12 transfer students had all come from the same school, the same classroom, transferred together 3 weeks into the school year. The paperwork was sparse. No explanation for the transfer. No note about behavioral issues or learning difficulties. Just a form signed by the principal and a single line. Relocation due to district consolidation. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie the moment I read it. District consolidations don't happen in the middle of the school year. They don't result in the transfer of exactly 12 students from the same classroom. Something else had happened. Something that had forced these children to be moved, to be separated from their original school and sent here, to Riverside Elementary, where they could continue their game with fresh victims. I called the previous school. The secretary who answered seemed confused by my questions, as though I was asking about something that had happened so long ago that it had already faded into irrelevance. "Those students," she said carefully, her voice taking on a cautious quality. "Yes, they transferred. Is there a problem?" "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just checking in. They seem like good kids." There was a pause. A long pause. The kind of pause that contains entire conversations, entire worlds of unspoken understanding. "They are good kids," she said finally. "But you might want to keep an eye on them. And on yourself." She hung up before I could ask what she meant. The words haunted me for days. Keep an eye on yourself. What did that mean? What was I supposed to be watching for? I tried to call back, but the secretary wouldn't take my calls. I tried to speak to the principal, but he was unavailable. The school seemed to have closed ranks, to have decided that whatever had happened there was not something that should be discussed with outsiders. The counting became more frequent. I started to see it everywhere, in the hallway, in the cafeteria, in the library. Always the same pattern. A child would be singled out, the others would count silently, and then someone would speak a number. The child would leave, shoulders heavy, eyes distant. And the others would return to whatever they'd been doing, as though a transaction had been completed, as though something had been exchanged and the balance had been restored. I tried to stop it. I pulled the children aside, asked them directly what the game was, what the numbers meant. They wouldn't tell me. Not because they were being defiant, but because they seemed genuinely afraid. One girl, when I pressed her, whispered so quietly that I had to lean in to hear her. "If we tell you, you have to play." "Play what?" I demanded. She shook her head and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway with more questions than answers, with a growing sense of dread that seemed to settle deeper into my chest with each passing day. By the third week, I noticed something else. The children who were counted seemed to change. Not dramatically, but there was a hollowness to them afterward, a quality of absence. They still came to school, they still did their work, they still went through the motions of being alive, but something had been taken from them, something essential. Their eyes had a glazed quality, as though they were looking at the world through a pane of frosted glass. Their voices were quieter, more hesitant. They moved through the day like people going through the motions of living without actually being alive, like ghosts who hadn't yet realized they were dead. And the transfer students, they seemed lighter, brighter, as though they were feeding on something, as though each counting ritual gave them a small infusion of energy, a small taste of something they craved. Their smiles became more genuine, their laughter became louder. They seemed to be thriving in a way that the other children were not. I started keeping a log. Every time I saw the counting game, I wrote down the date, the time, the child who was counted, and the number that was spoken. The numbers were never the same. They ranged from single digits to numbers in the hundreds. There was no pattern I could discern, no logic, just numbers, spoken with a kind of ritualistic precision, as though each one had been chosen for a reason I couldn't understand. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the classroom with one of the transfer students, a quiet boy named Thomas. He was organizing books on the shelf, moving slowly, deliberately, with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he was using the task as a way to avoid thinking about something. I took a chance. I asked him directly, "Thomas, what are the numbers?" He didn't turn around. His hands continued to move along the shelf, placing each book in its proper place. "You don't want to know," he said finally. "Try me." He was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched between us, heavy and pregnant with meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that I had to strain to hear him. days you have left." My blood went cold. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, refusing to dissipate, refusing to be forgotten. "Left until what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could feel it in my bones, in the deepest part of my consciousness. "Until it's your turn to play." He finished organizing the books and left the classroom without another word, leaving me standing there, frozen, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the empty shelf and try to process what he'd just told me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what he'd said. Days until what? Until I had to play their game? The thought was absurd, and yet I couldn't shake it. I got up and went to my computer, searching for information about the previous school, about the transfer students, about anything that might explain what was happening. I found nothing. No news articles, no reports, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Just a school that existed and 12 children who had left it. It was as though they had been erased, as though the system had decided that whatever had happened there was not something that should be documented or discussed. By the following week, I'd convinced myself that I was overreacting. The children were playing a game, yes, but it was just a game. The numbers meant nothing. The hollowness I saw in the counted children was probably just my imagination, my mind finding patterns where none existed. I was a rational person, a scientist in my own way. I didn't believe in curses or supernatural nonsense. I believed in facts, in evidence, in things that could be measured and quantified. And then I started hearing the numbers. It began in the morning as I was getting ready for school. A whisper, so faint I almost missed it. 28. I stopped, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the shower, the sound of water running, the ordinary sounds of morning. I told myself it was my imagination. The mind plays tricks when it's tired, when it's stressed, when it's been exposed to too much uncertainty. But it happened again that afternoon. 35. And again that evening. 41. Always different numbers, always whispered in a voice I didn't recognize, always when I was alone. I checked my apartment. Locked doors, locked windows, no sign of intrusion. I told myself I was stressed. Too much work, too little sleep. The mind plays tricks when it's tired. The rationalization lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, I heard the counting. I was sitting at my desk during lunch, grading papers, when I became aware of a sound beneath the ambient noise of the school. Soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I looked up. The classroom was empty. The door was closed. And yet the sound continued, growing slightly louder, more distinct. Not a heartbeat. Voices, multiple voices, whispering in unison, counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The counting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against my ears like a physical thing. I walked to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. The counting had come from inside the classroom, but there was no one there. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I closed the door and sat back down at my desk, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard, and I knew what it meant. That afternoon, I called in sick. I drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind racing through possibilities, each one more terrible than the last. I was losing my mind. I was being pranked by the children. I was being haunted by something I didn't understand. I was being hunted. I sat in my apartment and tried to think clearly. The transfer students had brought something with them. A game, yes, but not just a game. Something that fed on numbers, on the act of counting, on the fear of being counted. Something that had learned my name and was now coming for me. And now it had noticed me. Now it was counting down the days until I would have to play. The whispers continued that night. Different numbers, always whispered, always when I was alone. 56, 19, 83. I tried to ignore them, but they were relentless, pressing into my consciousness like water seeping through cracks in a dam. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes burning, my thoughts scattered and fragmented. I called the previous school again. This time, I demanded to speak to the principal. It took 3 transfers and a lot of insistence, but finally, a woman's voice came on the line. She sounded tired, defeated, like someone who had been waiting for this call for a very long time. "Mr. Chen," she said, as though she'd been expecting my call. "I'm Principal Morrison. I understand you're calling about the transfer students." "What are they?" I asked bluntly. "What did they do to my school?" There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could hear the weight of whatever she was about to tell me. "They didn't do anything, Mr. Chen. They're victims, just like you're about to become. The counting game, it's not something they invented, it's something that was done to them. And now they're doing it to others, because that's how it works. You count someone, you pass it on. You get a reprieve, a few weeks of peace before it starts again." "That's insane," I whispered. "Yes," she agreed. "It is, but it's also real, and it's coming for you. The numbers you're hearing, they're a countdown. When they reach 0, the game will begin, and you'll have to choose. Play and pass it on, or keep it and let it consume you." "How do I stop it?" I asked desperately. "You don't," she said. "You just delay it. You pass it on to someone else and you get a few weeks of peace, and then it comes back, and you have to do it again, and again, and again, until eventually you can't anymore, until you're too tired to pass it on, until you decide to keep it." She hung up before I could respond. I didn't go back to school. I called in sick for a week, then 2 weeks. The numbers continued, growing louder, more insistent. 30, 20, 10. And with each number, I felt something shifting inside me, something dark and hungry beginning to wake. I understood, finally, what the hollow children had experienced. The sensation of being hollowed out, of having something essential extracted and replaced with a void. I tried everything. I tried to ignore the whispers. I tried to drown them out with music and television and the sound of my own voice. I tried to leave town, to drive away from Riverside and never look back. But the numbers followed me. They were inside my head now, part of my own consciousness, impossible to escape. On the day the counting reached 0, I sat in my classroom alone. The children had been sent home early. The building was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the whispers that had become so loud they were almost screams. I could feel it now, the presence that had been growing stronger with each passing day. It was in the room with me. It was in my head. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked at the door. The 12 transfer students stood in the doorway, their faces calm, their eyes empty. Behind them, I could see others, children from my school, children from the previous school, children I didn't recognize. All of them hollow, all of them waiting, all of them counting silently, their lips moving in unison, their eyes fixed on me. "It's time to play," one of them said. I stood up. My hands were shaking. My mind was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but what I knew I had to do. But I was so tired, so very tired of hearing the numbers, of feeling the weight of that void pressing down on me. So tired of being hunted. "What do I have to do?" I asked. They formed a circle around me, and they began to count. Not silently this time, out loud, their voices overlapping, creating a sound like wind through a tunnel, like the earth itself breathing. 1, 2, 3. I closed my eyes and waited for it to be over, for the moment when I could pass it on, when I could feel that terrible lightness that came with knowing someone else was carrying the weight. But as the counting continued, I realized something. The numbers weren't going up, they were going down. 99, 98, 97. And I understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of my exhaustion, that I wasn't going to get to pass this on. I was going to be the one who held it forever. The counting continued as I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen as the numbers descended toward a zero that would never come, toward an ending that would never arrive, toward a void that would consume me completely and utterly, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell that would walk through the world, counting silently, waiting for the next person to join the game. The children's voices rose around me, and I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only numbers, only the endless, terrible counting. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear other voices joining in, other children, other teachers, other people who had made the same choice I had made, who had tried to pass it on, who had failed. We were all counting now, all of us together, an endless chorus of voices descending into darkness, into a void that had no bottom, no end, no escape. The counting continued. It always does.